What if I told you that this bottle was actually born from war? And in this bottle, there is a story, both like yet unlike anything that you've ever heard. It's a story of silent courage, resilience, and the will to fight for what is right in the eyes of the few and the snapping jaws of the many. Hello and welcome everybody, my name is Mavis Shahar, and if you enjoyed dark and obscure history, go ahead and hit that like and subscribe button. Today's story is about a big brother and a sister in the thralls of the world wars. Bet by the picture you could probably guess that we are telling a lesser known story about Christian Dior and his sister Jeanette Catherine Dior. Oh yes, Christian Dior, a legendary name that everybody knows. Designer, lover of women, powerhouse in couture, but also he is a big brother. He was a protector and he was a caretaker. Christian was one of 5 siblings, and in his early life, Dior was not a luxury name. In fact, it was actually associated with manure. The Dior family made money from a fertilizer/chemical business, and because of this, the family was very wealthy, very well off. But when World War I rolled around, the family pretty much lost everything because of wartime happenings and bad investments. They basically became destitute. Christian, along with his other siblings, had to work to put food on the table, and in the midst of all of that, a miracle happened. And on August 2nd of 1917, his mother had given birth to a baby girl, his youngest sister, Jeanette Catherine Dior. Their parents were Maurice Dior, a successful industrialist, and Madeleine Dior, a woman deeply invested in gardening, flowers, and big cultural refinement. The family lived comfortably in Granville, Normandy, where Madeleine maintained extensive gardens that would later help influence Christian Dior's aesthetic and lifelong attachment to florals. Catherine grew up in a household that valued discipline, privacy, and self-containment. She wasn't groomed for the public attention like her siblings were, or fashion, or leadership. How she was raised shaped how she was and how she did things later in life. So her history is very hard to trace because, here's the problem. Women like Catherine didn't leave diaries. So to understand her choices and what most likely could have happened to her, we have to understand the world that she lived in at the time. Let me paint you a picture. I got an A-ish in art, I think. I got you. Catherine came of age in Paris in a very wavering time for France. After World War I, France faced many problems. Among them were economic instability, deep national trauma, and a strong desire for normalcy. Things didn't happen back then politically and economically at the rate they do today. The country entered the 1930s politically divided and economically fragile. When Germany invaded France in May of 1940, the French military collapsed in just a matter of a few weeks. Paris fell in June of 1940, and France was divided basically into 2 zones: German-occupied and the Free Zone. The Free Zone was controlled by the Vichy regiment, which actively collaborated with Nazi authorities anyways, though. So they implemented anti-Jewish laws, censorship, and cooperation with German government. So much for free, right? New life was very hard in France. Food rationing, curfews, added surveillance, and an increase in arrests. For many people, this meant that survival depended on compliance, as it normally does. Catherine and Christian, though, lived together on and off over the course of World War II. And at some point in the very early 1940s, Catherine started harboring a very dangerous secret. She became involved with the French resistance, specifically the F2 intelligence network. The F2 network was founded in July of 1940 by Polish military intelligence officers stranded in France after the German invasion. Its primary function was to gather intelligence for the Allies, particularly Britain, though. F2 operatives collected and transmitted information on things like German troop movement, logistics, military insights, basically anything that could help the Allies in the war. F2 relied heavily on couriers and code. Catherine's exact role is not exhaustively documented, as much of her life is not documented. But that is very typical for intelligence work. However, Historical researchers place her in intelligence support and transmission. That work carried a very high risk of arrest, and she worked it for a while. But on July 6th of 1944, she was stopped and arrested by the Gestapo in Paris. Now, I know you've heard of the Gestapo before, but for those of you who don't know, I see the little wheels in your head turning. So I'll tell you. The Gestapo were basically like Nazis' secret police. And if you have a sense of horror or dread when you think of them, or you think of that, you're right to. You really should.
Was jetzt passieren wird, Sturmbannführer. Sie werden aufstehen und mit uns durch diese Tür hinausgehen.
Nein, das glaube ich nicht. Ich glaube, Sie und ich, wir beide wissen, Hauptsturmführer, dass egal, was mit den anderen Leuten hier in diesem Raum passiert, wir zwei nirgendwo hingehen. Das ist wirklich schade um Oberfeldwebel Wilhelm und seine berühmten Freunde. Falls einer von euch vorhat, am Leben zu bleiben, werdet ihr sie auch erschießen müssen.
Sieht so aus, als ob Klein Max als Waise aufwächst. Wie traurig.
See, they weren't there to uphold normal law and order. Nay. It existed to eliminate political and ideological threats to the Nazi state. That meant communists, Jews, resistance members, intelligence operatives, and anyone else who would actively undermine German control were targeted. But most importantly, they were legally exempt from the judicial law, which meant no warrants, no trials, no appeals, and no oversight. Arrest by the Gestapo meant you disappeared in an invisible but evident system. When Catherine was taken by the Gestapo and taken into their custody, this is where historical records become even more obscure, because intelligence work was designed to leave as little trace possible. And on top of that, Catherine didn't leave behind a personal account of this period. Go figure. And there are no detailed records describing her individual experience through this interrogation. So rather than fill in those gaps with potential speculation, I feel the only responsible way to understand what Catherine likely faced is to look at what happened to other F2 intelligence network members who were also arrested by the Gestapo around the same time. During my own personal readings, what emerged from this period of research aren't isolated moments of hell, right? But a system of torture.
Ooh, that's a bingo.
Specifically for intelligence operatives, arrest was not the end, it was the beginning of a very painful and long extraction process. The Gestapo were not focused on justice. Their goal was to dismantle resistance networks as efficiently as possible, especially intelligence networks that fed information directly to the Allies. It unfolded over time, often lasting days, weeks, months, and it all followed a deliberate pattern. Prisoners were disoriented first, moved between locations, denied any clear sense of time, and kept isolated. Exhaustion was one of the Gestapo's primary tools. Sleep deprivation was widely documented. Prisoners were questioned repeatedly, allowed brief periods of rest, and then questioned again. Unfortunately, physical violence was also used in a controlled and escalating type of way. Survivor testimonials consistently describe beatings, prolonged standing, and stress position designed to cause pain without immediately incapacitating the prisoner, allowing the interrogation to continue. Also, food and water were frequently restricted as well to get people to talk. I definitely would talk, but probably just for a hostess. And prisoners were threatened with execution, told that the other one had already talked, and they confronted them with partial information to convince them that their silence was pointless and they should just talk. Whether the claims were ever true or not, they were used to create undeniable doubt in their prisoners' minds. For intelligence agents, this phase often lasted longer than other resistance prisoners. That's because intelligence cases were not about individual guilt. They were about the collapse of an entire system. One name could expose a radio operator. One address could dismantle an entire cell. And the Gestapo understood that intelligence networks functioned through connection, and interrogation was designed specifically to sever these connections piece by agonizing piece. Women were not spared of this process. In fact, women involved in intelligence were often considered especially dangerous. They moved more freely and attracted way less suspicion than their counterparts. Sexual violence in Gestapo custody is historically documented, though it remains egregiously underreported as many survivors never spoke publicly about it after the war. It was a very different time way back then, but I will say that silence is not evidence that it did not occur. It is evidence of how deeply damaging it was at the time. Eventually, when interrogators believed that they have extracted what they could, or when the time ran out as the war began to turn against Germany, prisoners that were captured alongside Catherine were removed from the interrogation system altogether. They were not released, though. They were not released. They were also not spared. They were actually deported. And Catherine was not exempt from this. She was also on that deportation list. And around this time, Christian Dior learned that his sister was in the Gestapo custody because those arrests were very public, very in broad daylight, but he searched for her through official inquiries and informal information channels. The system that he was digging into was designed to keep families ignorant, so Christian had no reliable information, but he didn't give up hope. What sustained him was refusal. Stopping looking would mean accepting that she was already gone, and he just couldn't do that. He knew his sister was a fighter and knew that she was at very least still in the Gestapo's custody. But Germany was losing and they were getting the hell out of France. The Nazis said, if I'm going down, I'm gonna take as many as I can with me. And sure as can be, they took Catherine with them. Catherine was sent to Ravensbrück concentration camp. Again, there is minimal documentation that could be found of Catherine's time here as well. A lot of information was found in journals written by companions that she was traveling with or people that had interacted with her. So to be responsible, I'm going to tell you what it was like there, but there is no solid evidence of what happened to her at her time in Ravensbrück. Ravensbrück occupies a strange and unsettling place in history of the Nazi camp systems. Unlike Auschwitz, it was not initially designed to be an extermination center. It was, however, the only known female concentration camp, and for much of the war, it existed in relative obscurity, both during the conflict and in the initial aftermath of the war. The obscurity was not accidental, though. And after reviewing some of the testimonials, I am convinced female-only testing took place at this camp, as well as a lot of other insidious things of which we will not be talking about here today. That's on your own time. Women arrived there as political prisoners, resistance members, intellectuals. Daily life inside Ravensbrück concentration camp was organized to strip people down slowly. Women were woken up before dawn for roll call and forced to stand for hours, sometimes until bodies collapsed, while guards just repeated the counts. Food was deliberately insufficient, very thin soup, a piece of bread if you're lucky, just enough to keep prisoners alive for labor, but never strong enough to recover. Work was constant and exhausting, and punishment was arbitrary, and illness spread unchecked. Medical care was absolutely minimal, except when bodies were being used for experimentation. By the time Catherine arrived, the camp was overcrowded and under-resourced. The war had turned against Germany, and conditions across the camp systems were deteriorating rapidly. Food rations were insufficient, disease was widespread, and forced labor actually intensified as the regime attempted to extract as much work as possible from prisoners before the system collapsed. What we can say with confidence, though, is that Catherine survived conditions that killed many others, unfortunately. She endured imprisonment, forced labor, and the final chaotic phase of the camp systems as Nazi control unraveled. Survival at Ravensbrück was not guaranteed by strength or by virtue. It depended on endurance, chance, and adaptability, from my personal take and my personal understanding. And when the war finally ended and she came back to France, what she carried with her was not a story that she wanted to tell publicly. Like many who lived through Ravensbrück, she chose silence. Not because nothing had happened, but because silence was socially reinforced at this time in Europe. Post-war Europe didn't really have a culture that was ready to hear about bodily degradation, starvation, loss of autonomy, humiliation, starvation, camp experimentation, sexual violence. The list is long. And Christian never pushed her to speak about things that she didn't want to. When she was reunited with Christian, there was no detailed record of a dramatic reunion between a brother and sister, no diary entry, no preserved letter documenting the moment. And honestly, Christian didn't know whether Catherine was alive for most of the war or not, and when she did return, an explanation wasn't probably needed. What mattered most to Christian Dior was presence. And after Catherine returned, her presence had changed as well. Life did not go back to the way that it was. Christian and Catherine were both forever altered by the events. Christian Dior was profoundly changed by the knowledge that his sister had survived when so many people had not. He didn't treat her survival as something to be displayed or explained to anyone, not even himself. Instead, he responded like an older brother. He responded with restraint, with protection, and with attention. Catherine, after everything, resumed a private life. She worked with flowers, she cultivated living things, and she chose routine and distance from public attention. She barely told anyone of her experiences. And Christian did not interrupt that choice. There is no evidence that he ever pressured her to speak, to remember publicly, or to turn her endurance into some sort of narrative. What Catherine carried did not need to be verbalized for him to understand its weight. And it is here, quietly, without ceremony, that her influence on Christian becomes very visible. Christian Dior's work after the war was not about excess, it was about restoration. And in 1947, when he introduced his first major collection and released the fragrance Miss Dior, the world framed it as a return to beauty after such devastation. But beneath that surface was something so much more personal. It was a bottle about the journey, his sister's survival and recovery and love. And the florals were not abstract. They echoed the gardens of his childhood, and the softness was not escapism. It reflected the life that Catherine had chosen after survival. The structure held restraint, not indulgence. Christian named the fragrance in honor of his sister, but not as a tribute to suffering, not as a spectacle of survival either, but more so, I think, as an act of preservation. Miss Dior became a vessel, not for trauma, but for endurance. Aww. It allowed resilience to exist without being exposed, and it carried in its essence the love, devotion, and adoration one brother had for his little sister. So, how does quiet courage become a memory in a bottle? Well, after much deliberation, I think it becomes memory when love refuses to forget, but also refuses to exploit. This is what this bottle holds to me, and that leaves us with something worth sitting with for a little while. The story isn't about the perfume. It isn't about the war. It's literally about preservation, resilience, love, and rebuilding. So I hope you can take away what I took away from it. But I will leave you with two questions. How did this story make you feel? I told you it's like and unlike anything you've ever heard. And whose quiet courage should we remember next? If there is someone famous or forgotten whose story deserves to be in the spotlight, who deserves space, let me know down below in the comments. Thank you guys so much for joining me on this journey about Catherine and Christian Dior. I hope you enjoyed it as much as I did, and I will see you guys next time.